This video is about twitch contraction, and a twitch contraction is the very brief contraction of all muscle fibers in a motor unit responding to a single action potential. So what I want you to remember here is that a motor unit, again, is one motor neuron that is connecting to anywhere between just a few muscle fibers to up to 2,000 muscle fibers in some of the larger muscles. But in any case, whether you're talking about a small motor unit or a very large motor unit, it's all controlled by one motor neuron. And so that one motor neuron will release one single action potential. And so this is what you're taking a look at right here, is the contraction of all muscle fibers in a motor unit when responding to one action potential. If you look at the diagram to the right, this is something that's called a myogram, which is the record of a muscle contraction. So taking a look at the y-axis, this is the force of contraction. So the higher that the curve gets, the stronger the force of contraction is. Looking at the x-axis, this is just time. So you can see that the time on this particular myogram is about 55 seconds. And so this is not atypical because twitches of muscle fibers last anywhere between 20 to 200 milliseconds. Now, even if you just last 20 milliseconds, this is still considerably longer than the 1 to 2 milliseconds that a muscle action potential lasts. So when you're talking about the twitch contraction versus the muscle action potential, I want to remind you that the muscle action potential is that change in the membrane of the skeletal muscle cell, and that change in the membrane potential sweeps over the entire skeletal muscle cell in about 1 to 2 milliseconds. So, so your twitch contraction is going to be quite long compared to the action potential. So let's talk about the periods that we see here on the myogram. The first is called the latent period, and basically you have a delay between the stimulus, which is time 0 on the graph, and the beginning of contraction. So this is going to last about 2 milliseconds. Now I realize looking at the graph that it looks like it lasts about 5 milliseconds. I suppose that's to make that latent period a little bit more visible on the graph. But the delay usually lasts about 2 milliseconds, and this is called the latent period. And as we discussed in the previous slide, it takes about 2 milliseconds for the muscle action potential to cover the entire cell. And so the muscle action potential will go over the sarcolemma, it'll go down the T-tubules, and as a result, you get calcium ions released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the latent period is the delay between the start of an action potential at the edges of a motor end plate to the opening of the calcium channels of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The contraction period lasts about 10 to 100 milliseconds. So during the contraction period, you have a number of things happening, and these are things that we've seen with the previous videos. I said that the latent period is the time between which you have an action potential start at the edges of the motor end plate and when calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So now we pick up after calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So now calcium is going to bind to troponin. This is going to change the shape of troponin, move tropomyosin. The myosin binding sites on actin are exposed. This is going to allow for cross bridges to form, and at this point, you're going to get peak tension in the muscle fiber. So if you look at the graph to the right, you can see that the contraction period starts with the force of contraction at just about 0, and it goes to its highest point during this period. The relaxation period also lasts between 10 to 100 milliseconds. So I did say in the first slide that a twitch contraction could last anywhere between 20 to 200 milliseconds. And so that's basically a combination of the contraction period and the relaxation period. So during the relaxation period, first of all, calcium gets actively transported back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So those calcium pumps that return calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, they're always on. And in the absence of an action potential, they'll start working really hard to get calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is what happens during this period. Now, when calcium leaves the sarcoplasm to go back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, then it's also going to leave troponin. So troponin shifts back to its original shape. It's going to shift the location of tropomyosin back over the myosin binding sites on actin, and at this point they're covered. At this point, of course, myosin heads are going to detach from actin, and because there's no cross-bridging, you're going to see the titin proteins that are attached to the thick fibers or the thick filaments start pushing the edges of the Z disc back towards their relaxed state. And so without any cross-bridging, the tension in the muscle fiber is going to decrease pretty dramatically. In fact, back down to what it was before the contraction began. So the next thing we're going to talk about is frequency of stimulation. And here is something that's called wave summation. And so wave summation is going to happen when a second action potential triggers a muscle contraction before the first contraction has finished. So I want to remind you that an action potential lasts about 2 milliseconds and a twitch contraction lasts about 20 milliseconds. So there's plenty of time for a second action potential to come in before the twitch contraction has actually finished. And so if we take a look at the myograms below, here on the y-axis you've got the force of contraction, so the higher that the curve, the stronger that the contraction is. Going to the right is the time in milliseconds, so basically you can use this axis to see how fast that the action potentials are actually coming in. Okay, this is a single myogram, and so what you have is a complete twitch contraction, where you've gone through the latent period, where you've gone through contraction, where you've gone through relaxation, and a second action potential hasn't come in, so that's it. You just get the one twitch. Here and here, basically what you're seeing is you're seeing the first twitch contraction not having enough time to finish before the second action potential comes in and sets off additional tension in the middle of the first twitch contraction. So at this point, the contraction gets stronger because there's been no time for relaxation. You've basically just gone to a much stronger contraction instead of relaxation. Now, you'll notice that there is a relaxation after this second contraction, if another action potential hasn't come in. Now, if you look to the right, you see a different scenario. You see action potentials coming in and causing twitch contractions in pretty rapid succession. There's still a little bit of relaxation in between the twitch contractions, but they do happen pretty quickly. And so at this point, you've generated a much stronger force of contraction with the additional action potentials. This is something that is called unfused tetanus, where you've got a series of action potentials causing successively stronger and stronger contractions within the same motor unit. Finally, we have what's called fused tetanus. This is sometimes called fused tetany. And so what's happening here is that the action potentials are coming in so rapidly that the motor unit reaches its peak, its absolute maximum contraction without any sort of relaxation period at all. And so basically what's happened here is the muscle has shot from being relaxed all the way up to complete maximum contraction because there are a lot of action potentials coming in and causing this peak contraction. The next concept that we've got here, I think, is a really cool one. And so this is something that's called motor unit recruitment. And in this, motor unit recruitment is a process in which you have a number of active motor units increasing. And so one thing I want you to think about right now is that each repetition of that cross-bridge cycle is going to cost an ATP. And When you think about how many crossbred cycles have to go into shrinking just one sarcomere, much less one muscle fiber, much less an entire motor unit, then you can see that even contracting a single motor unit is going to be very expensive in terms of ATP. So basically, what your body tries to do is to use the minimum number of motor units to get the job done that you're trying to get done. So the weakest motor units get recruited first for a particular job, followed by the stronger motor units. And I want you to think about this. Think about using your biceps brachii. So as you pick up a pencil, you're not going to need a lot of motor units to pick up a pencil. It's something that's very lightweight, and so you're going to recruit the weakest motor unit in your biceps to try to get that job done. Now, if you're lifting, say, a full large suitcase, this is something that's going to be a lot more difficult. And you may notice that there's a little bit of a lag when you begin to try to lift the suitcase and when you can actually lift it. It's because when that weakest motor unit fails to do the job initially, then you recruit more and more and more motor units until you can actually get the job done. Okay, so that's the first bullet point here, that the weakest motor units get recruited first, followed by the stronger motor units. Now, if we take a look at the second bullet point here, this is something that I think is also a neat concept, and it's that motor units will contract alternately in order to sustain contractions for a longer period of time. So you may have noticed that it's a lot more difficult to actually lift and hold something. So let's say that you lifted your suitcase, that initial lift is going to be pretty difficult. But if you wanted to hold the suitcase in place, say with your arm at a 90-degree angle, that's going to get very difficult as time goes on, and you're going to have a strain, almost not a muscle strain, but it's going to be difficult almost immediately. And so here's the reason why. If you take a look at the diagrams below, you'll see on the left diagram that it's showing 3 different motor units, 3 different motor neurons attaching to 3 different motor units, red, blue, and purple. Okay, and so 3 motor units governed by 3 neurons. Now, what happens when you hold something is that once you do the initial lift, your muscle will start alternating between motor units to try to sustain that contraction. So motor unit 1 might hold the suitcase for a small amount of time, and when it starts to relax, motor unit 2 kicks in and sustains the hold, and then it'll relax. Motor unit 3 will kick in. At this point, motor unit 1 has had a little bit of time for recovery and comes back in. But at this point, when you lift, you might be using most of the motor units in the muscle, but when you hold something in place, you're only using a portion of the available motor units. And this is the reason why holding something for a duration of time is so much harder than lifting it in the first place. Okay, so these are just arrows that are pointing out the different motor units. There's motor unit 1, there's motor unit 2, and there's motor unit 3. Sorry, I didn't show you the arrows beforehand. Okay, now we're going to talk about something that's a little bit different, and this is something that's called muscle tone. So even when your muscles are at rest, you're going to get a small amount of tension generated called tone. And so this is not voluntary. This is not something that you have any control over. This is involuntary contraction of motor units. Now, the whole point here is basically to keep skeletal muscles firm. So essentially, there's a pretty good principle with muscle tissue, and it's if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And so basically the idea here is for muscle tone to keep the skeletal muscles firm but not produce movement. So you're producing enough tension to be using the muscle and hopefully not lose a lot of muscle mass over time. And I think the biggest example that I can give for what happens when this goes wrong is when someone has a spinal injury. So you may have seen someone who is, you may have seen on the news a particular athlete get a spinal injury, and when they first hold a press conference, when you first see them and they're in a wheelchair, the proportion of their legs looks pretty much like it did before they got injured. But if you see them 2 or 3 years later down the road, then the mass in their legs appears to have shrunk dramatically. And the reason why is not only are they not getting the voluntary movement that would be coming through, um, they're not getting this involuntary contraction of motor units either, because this is something that comes from the central nervous system. And if they don't have even muscle tone generated, then their muscles are going to atrophy that much more quickly and to that greater an extent. Okay, there are different types of contractions, isotonic and isometric. And so if you take a look at this first term, isotonic, tonic meaning tone, so the degree of tension in the muscle. So in an isotonic contraction, the tension is constant and the muscle length changes. So basically you're not increasing or decreasing the force of contraction, but the angle of the joint will actually change. Now in a concentric contraction, the tension is greater than what you're trying to lift, the load is. And so if you take a look at figure A, this is concentric contraction while picking up a book. So the length of the muscle is going to shorten. You're going to, even though you're maintaining a constant tension, at this point the constant tension that you're generating is enough to lift the load. In an eccentric contraction, the muscle will lengthen, and in this case the load is greater than the tension that's being generated. So if you're actually decreasing, if the muscle length is increasing but you're not increasing the effort that you're putting into it, then you can get a lengthening of the muscle. That is an eccentric contraction. And generally, I would kind of characterize a concentric contraction as happening when you are able to generate enough tension to lift the load. So let's say that you had a bar curl that was 20 pounds, and you wanted to lift this 20 pounds with both of your arms. At that point, when you succeed at it, you have a concentric isotonic contraction. But let's say that somebody says, okay, well, hold the bar steady and I'm going to throw 50 more pounds on there. So 60 might be a little bit much for you to even hold in place. And at that point, even though you're trying as hard as you can, the muscle length lengthens. And so the bar goes down, your biceps can't lift it, the muscle is lengthening even though you're putting tension into it, and that is something that would be called an eccentric isotonic contraction. The second major term on the slide here is isometric, and metric meaning length. In this case, the muscle contracts, but it doesn't change length. And I can remember a time when isometrics were considered to be a really great exercise. And what you would do in isometrics is to go push on a wall or door frame, something that you couldn't move. Your muscles would contract and you would be putting all the effort that you could into it, but the muscle wouldn't change length. And that was the idea behind isometrics, is that you try to move something that you're completely unable to move, but the tension that's generated in the muscle gives you a workout.